Dear Diary, well, this is strange. Everyone in Ireland is being asked to self-isolate because of this virus. It's scary, but I've got to be honest, I'm kinda looking forward to having some time to myself. I'm naturally introverted, so these next few weeks should be pretty enjoyable. So the Resident Evil 3 remake recently released, and as a huge fan of the series, I was all over that shit. Last year's remake of Resident Evil 2 was my favourite game of 2019, so I had very high expectations for Capcom's reimagining of the third entry in the series. However, in the months leading up to Resident Evil 3's release, I began to have doubts about whether the game could possibly live up to my expectations. After all, Resident Evil 3 Remake was releasing just 15 months after the remake of the second game. Surely that wouldn't be enough time to create the kind of remake the original Resident Evil 3 deserved. Well, now that I've completed the game 3 times, I think I'm ready to give my final thoughts on the title. This is going to be a long one, because I've got a lot to say about this game. So let's get into it. Dear Diary, I'm having the time of my life so far. This is great. I'm able to just sit on my ass and watch Netflix all day. I also finally have the time to sit down and play through all the video games from my backlog. I'm starting to think that this quarantine should never end. Resident Evil 3 is probably the strangest remake of a video game I have ever played, simply because it does not feel like a remake of its source material in any meaningful way. I mean, sure, Nemesis is still in the game. Occasionally. And sure, you're still playing as Jill Valentine. Occasionally. But in practically every other way, Resident Evil 3 Remake feels almost like an entirely different game from the original. Now that's not necessarily a bad thing, but if you're buying Resident Evil 3 Remake because you want to re-experience some of your favourite moments from the original game in HD, you're going to be incredibly disappointed. Approach the Resident Evil 3 Remake as a companion piece to the original instead of a replacement for it, and you'll probably enjoy the experience a whole lot more. I'm bored now. Warning: full spoilers for the Resident Evil 3 Remake ahead. If you have not yet completed the game, please do so before watching the remainder of this video. Resident Evil 3 Remake's opening is slightly different from the original. Instead of getting an FMV sequence showing Raccoon City being invaded by zombies, we're instead shown a live action news station talking about all the carnage currently happening within the city. I think it was a very strange decision to go with live action for this opening cutscene. Did Capcom not have the time to create an FMV sequence? Anyways, the game then cuts to a first person perspective. We're currently in Jill Valentine's apartment, but something feels off. All the colour has been sucked out of the place, and it's raining heavily outside. We go to the bathroom and are greeted by the lovely face of... Oh Jesus. Jill then awakens at her desk. I was uncertain about the meaning behind this nightmare sequence the first time I watched it, but now I think it represents Jill's fear of becoming a zombie herself. The nightmare could also signify that Jill is actually already infected and is slowly succumbing to the virus. If you've played any other game in the Resident Evil series, you'll know that every protagonist in this franchise is able to be bitten by a zombie without turning into the undead themselves. It has always been one of the biggest plot holes in the entire series, but up until now, players have had to wave it away as just a concession that had to be made in order to make an enjoyable survival horror series. But Resident Evil 3 actually addresses this long unanswered question through a few text documents. Unfortunately, we aren't given any clear answers as to why Jill has not yet become a zombie, but I still appreciated the game referencing it at all, and hopefully this storyline will be expanded upon in future titles. I actually loved this whole first person sequence because it reminded me a lot of walking around Henry Townsend's apartment in Silent Hill 4. I just wished there had been more quiet moments like this, because once the gameplay properly starts, it never really lets up until the conclusion. Jill receives a phone call from Brad, warning her to leave her apartment, but before she has the chance to, this sexy boy appears. Yes, in the remake, Nemesis wastes little time in making his presence known. Jill now has to get out of her apartment building as quickly as possible. Unfortunately, I'm really not a fan of this escape sequence. It's far too scripted for its own good. You don't really feel like you have control over anything that happens during this entire section of the game. Anyways, Jill eventually escapes and meets up with Brad, and the two of them team up to try and escape the city. They try to barricade themselves inside a bar to hold back the zombies, but then this happens. Okay, I'm sorry, but I really hate how Brad's death is handled in this remake. In the original game, Brad is brutally killed by Nemesis at the Raccoon City Police Department.
Jill! Brad! We've gotta... Jill! Help!
Nemesis then pursues Jill for the remainder of the game, and all of this was done on purpose. This scene is meant to show the player that this Nemesis guy is not to be fucked with, and that if you encounter him, it's time to start running. But here, Brad's just bitten by some random fucking zombie. He deserved a better death than that. Sorry. It's okay, Brad. It's not your fault. Jill takes Brad's advice and makes a run for it. She finds a pistol on a corpse and heads towards a nearby parking lot where a helicopter is waiting to pick her up. She makes it to the rooftop of the parking lot when this happens. With Nemesis quickly approaching, you only have a few moments to press X a few times. Can I just quickly say that I hate how scripted this whole opening is. The rest of the game has practically no scripted sequences whatsoever, so I don't understand why this crap made it into the beginning of the game. Something I didn't expect is that you can actually die if you somehow manage to fuck this sequence up. And it's probably the most brutal death Jill can experience in the entire game. So after driving yourself and Nemesis off the parking lot roof, you're left utterly defenseless to defend yourself against this creature. That's when this pretty boy shows up to save the day.
Hey! Fuckface! Hey, easy, lady. I got you.
Who are you? What are you
My
doing?
name's Carlos, and I'm saving you. Come on, let's get you someplace safe.
Actually, can I just take a second to talk about how much I love Carlos in this game? Carlos is a member of the Umbrella Biohazard Countermeasure Service and has been called in to help evacuate any civilians still alive in the city. I wasn't a fan of him at all in the original Resident Evil 3, but in the remake he's frequently charming and funny, and it's difficult not to like him.
It's alright, you're going ahead. I'm not gonna die on you, leave you in a cold, cruel, Carlosless world.
Okay.
Jill Valentine is also perfect in the remake. Her characterization in the game is far stronger than it was in the original. She's much tougher and more independent than she was in the PS1 game. She's a kind soul who never gives up on anyone, even when it's obvious they're beyond help. But she also isn't above telling someone to go fuck themselves if they piss her off.
Put out a few flames.
Fuck you.
My only issue with Jill in this game is that she swears way too much. Now let me explain, because I'm sure people are going to be calling me a prude in the comments. It's not that I have a problem with swearing in video games, but I've been a fan of the series from the beginning, when I would watch my dad play the original Resident Evil on the PS1. I've played and replayed every game in this series an unhealthy amount of times over the last 20 years, and not once during those 2 decades did Jill ever develop Tourette's. Again, I don't mind Jill swearing, it's just weird hearing her speaking like this as a long-time fan.
Look, just so you know, this is the last fucking time.
Dear Diary, great news. I was starting to get very lonely being stuck in my apartment all day, but thankfully I made a new friend yesterday. He's so funny and he loves me so much. Isn't that right, Woody?
What?
I said you're my best friend and that you love me, isn't that right?
That's right, Ben. I love you so much. You're my best friend.
Aw, thanks, Woody.
Sacrifice your firstborn child to me.
What did you say?
Nothing. I love you.
Aw. Anyways, Carlos and Jill hurry away from Nemesis and take refuge in a nearby subway train. Jill is introduced to Carlos's teammate Mikhail and is given the task of getting the trains up and running again so that she can help the civilians on board evacuate. She heads back up to the streets of Raccoon City to try and restore power to the subway trains. This is where the game properly begins, in my opinion. While the prologue in Resident Evil 3 Remake is almost entirely linear, the game really opens up once you return to ground level. This part of Raccoon City serves as a hub area of sorts, where you can complete optional puzzles, find hidden supplies, and open shortcuts that allow faster traversal of the city. Unfortunately, hub areas like this are very rare in the Resident Evil 3 Remake. Most of the time, the player is simply funneled from one linear set piece to the next, so I wish there had been a few more open-ended areas like this in the game. Exploring Raccoon City in Resident Evil 3 is a delight because the environments feel more detailed and alive than they did in Resident Evil 2. That's mostly due to the fact that Resident Evil 3 takes place during the citywide outbreak, while RE2 takes place sometime after it. The city is soaked in bright neon lights, and you can tell that the environmental artist had a lot of fun recreating Raccoon City for this game. Gameplay wise, you can expect something very similar to last year's RE2 remake. The game is still played entirely from a third person perspective. Zombies will still try to bite your neck. Resource management is still important, although there is considerably more ammo in RE3 Remake than you might be used to. I'd recommend starting the game on hardcore mode if you consider yourself competent at survival horror games, because normal won't offer much of a challenge to seasoned Resident Evil players. However, while Resident Evil 3 does share many similarities with last year's offering, it still has a few ideas of its own. For one thing, Jill can execute a dodge at any time by pressing the R1 button. This is a vital mechanic as enemies in the RE3 remake are far more aggressive than they were in the RE2 remake. Also, by pushing the dodge button at the very last second before you are attacked by an enemy, you will perform a perfect dodge. When you perform a perfect dodge, time will appear to slow down. During this time, you can also press L2 to lock onto the head of the enemy who tried to attack you and unload on him. Perfect dodge feels incredibly satisfying to pull off and never got old for me, even after I had put over 20 hours into the game. Hello, Diary, you fuck. How come you never respond to me? I'm sharing all this personal stuff with you, but you don't seem to want to open up about yourself at all. Who the fuck do you think you are? Well, you can forget about me sharing any more about my life until you start opening up to me. Puzzles were a major part of the original Resident Evil 3. In fact, I think it would be fair to say that Resident Evil 3 had more puzzles in it than practically any other game in the entire series. so why they have all but been removed from the remake is beyond me. In my opinion, there are really only 2 proper puzzles in the entire game, unless you consider using a lockpick on a lock as a puzzle. I don't really understand the decision to remove one of the most enjoyable and prominent aspects of the original Resident Evil 3. The complete lack of puzzles sometimes makes the game feel like a linear third-person shooter, where you're constantly being led from one linear set piece to the next. That does not mean, however, that some of these set pieces aren't well designed and very enjoyable. Probably my favourite one-off sequence in the game comes when Jill makes it to the power station to try and get the subway trains running again. To restore the power, Jill needs to first turn on 4 generators in the area. However, this area is quite maze-like and it can be very easy to get lost. What's worse, however, is that this area is full of these spider fucks. And if they get a hold of you, they'll puke their spider babies down your throat. If Jill does not find a green herb in time to vomit them back up, she will meet a very gruesome end. This whole sequence is incredibly intense, especially on higher difficulties, and I breathe a sigh of relief every time I make it the fuck out of this area. I just wish there had been more sequences like this in the game. Dear Diary, I'm so sorry about yesterday. I wasn't myself. I just don't understand why you won't let me in. I hope someday you'll trust me with your deepest, darkest secrets. I'd like that. Anyways, good news. I decided to create my own sitcom and I'm going to sell the idea to Netflix. I've already created the opening sequence. Anyways, shortly after restoring power to the subway trains, Jill bumps back into this asshole again. This is the game's first encounter with Nemesis that is not entirely scripted, and you should enjoy it while you can, because there aren't going to be many more like it. Nemesis is a very intimidating antagonist during the first half of the game. He can be very difficult to take down with lower powered weapons, so it's usually a better idea to just run away from him. However, that's easier said than done. If you try to run away from Nemesis, he will chase after you. He can jump in front of you, use his tentacles as a whip to pull you back towards him, and later on he can even use a bazooka. I really enjoyed the sequences where Nemesis stalks you throughout Raccoon City. The game is never more tense than when Nemesis is right on your tail. He reminds me a lot of the T-1000 from Terminator 1. He's terrifying, relentless, and will absolutely not stop, ever, until you are dead. And then an hour later the game says fuck that and reduces Nemesis to a glorified boss character for the rest of the game. So for some reason, the second Jill attempts to escape Raccoon City by using the subway train, Nemesis decides he's no longer interested in stalking you anymore. Instead, he transforms into this stupid looking fucker and only shows up as a boss fight for the rest of the game. As much as I like Resident Evil 3 Remake, the way Nemesis has been handled in the game is incredibly disappointing to me. Instead of being a terrifying creature who stalks you throughout the entire game, Nemesis has instead been reduced to a guest character in the remake. He doesn't show up nearly as often as he should, and I can't for the life of me figure out why. Dear Diary, Netflix told me to fuck off. So as I was saying, shortly after Jill escapes the area, Nemesis appears at the rear of the train, killing all the civilians on board in the process. Jill and Mikhail try to escape, but Nikolai has other plans. I guess now is a good time to explain who Nikolai is to anyone who has not played the original game before. Nikolai Zinovev is another member of the Umbrella Biohazard Countermeasure Service. Even though it initially appears that he is one of the good guys, it doesn't take long for the player to realize he's actually a little shit.
Your UBCS?
Yeah, careful, careful. Come on, don't look at me like that, alright? I'm not an infected.
Let's take care of
No, wait, please!
What the fuck?
He was infected.
He might have been infected.
In the original Resident Evil 3, Nikolai is a one-dimensional villain who comes off as a tired cliché at the best of times. However, I loved how he has been portrayed in the remake. He's such a cunning, selfless little prick, and I absolutely despised him by the end of the campaign, which is a mark of a good villain in my book. Anyway, Mikhail sacrifices himself to save Jill, and the train derails.
Get off my train. Shit, Barda!
Upon escaping the train wreckage, Jill finds herself in another area of Raccoon City. Specifically, she finds herself outside the clock tower from the PS1 game. FYI, the clock tower was my favourite location from the original game, so I wonder if you can guess my reaction when I learnt that the area had been completely cut from the remake. Here are your 3 options. Answer will be revealed in a future video. I was heartbroken at the removal of this location, especially since it could have solved practically all of the game's issues if the clock tower had been included in the remake. It would have been a great area to insert a few more puzzles into the game, making up for the complete lack of them elsewhere in the campaign. And it would have also easily increased the game's total playtime by another hour or 2, but I guess it wasn't to be. So outside the clock tower is where we have our first boss fight against Nemesis in his second form. And as I said earlier, I don't quite understand the decision to transform Nemesis into his second form so early into the campaign, especially considering that this boss fight towards the end of the game is almost identical to the fight at the clock tower. Personally, I think a better idea would have been to have this boss fight at the clock tower be similar to the one in the original game, where Nemesis hasn't yet changed into his second form. That way he would still be able to stalk you throughout the game's later environments, like the research facility. And only once you make it to this arena does Nemesis then transform into his second form. Would have been a lot more satisfying in my opinion. Hire me, Capcom. A delivery man came today with my shopping. He coughed on me. I bet he has the coronavirus. I've locked him in the bathroom until I figure out what to do.
You
with
could
him.
sacrifice him.
Stop asking me to sacrifice people. Shortly after defeating Nemesis at the clock tower, Jill gets infected and falls unconscious. Sometime later, Carlos finds her and takes her to the Raccoon City Hospital in the hopes of finding some way to cure her. The hospital is one of the more open areas in the game. In fact, it's the one part of the game that reminds me a lot of the original Resident Evil 3. There are plenty of rooms to explore and secrets to find. It was one of the more enjoyable sections of the game for me. The hospital is also where the player is introduced to the Hunter, a lizard-like creature that can kill you in a single attack if you aren't careful. The Hunter has always been my favourite enemy type in the Resident Evil series. They're terrifying creatures to run into, simply because of how deadly they can be. Unfortunately, I'm not a fan of how Hunters have been implemented in the RE3 remake. Firstly, their new design is kinda goofy and not as terrifying as it was in earlier games. Secondly, they're annoying as fuck to fight. All they do is hop about the place, making it nearly impossible to hit them at times. Also, their one-hit kill attack has almost no telegraphing beforehand. Finally seeing the Hunters in HD was one of the things I was looking forward to the most in the RE3 remake, and it's disappointing that they weren't able to live up to my expectations. I suppose I can't talk about the hospital sequence without bringing up the fact that just like in the original game, you occasionally take control of Carlos, so now I think it's a good time to cover his sequences and see how they compare with the rest of the game. So in Resident Evil 3 Remake, you actually take control of Carlos twice in the campaign, unlike in the original where he was only playable during the hospital portion of that game. You first take control of him during a short trip back to the Raccoon City Police Department from the RE2 Remake. I'm kinda conflicted about this part of the game, to be honest. On one hand, it's nice to be given more context for how events in the second game took place. For example, we get to see how Marvin Branagh got infected in the first place. It's also fun getting to see the Resident Evil series taking the piss out of itself.
Now here's a weird fucking door.
Leave it. We're here for bars.
On the other hand, however, Resident Evil 3 is a short enough game as is, so having to spend another half hour inside an environment I explored dozens of times last year was a bit disappointing. Nothing interesting happens during this section of the game. You shoot some zombies and knickers. You complete some basic puzzles that many of us will have already solved several times in the RE2 remake, and before you know it, it's over. Nemesis doesn't even show up. I get that it wouldn't have made much sense for Nemi to smash through the windows of the RCPD like he did in the original, since Carlos isn't a member of STARS. But I don't know. It would have been nice, you know? The areas where you control Carlos are considerably more action focused than the rest of the game. Carlos carries an assault rifle that tears through enemies in seconds, and that's important because there can be several enemies on screen at one time during some of these sections. For example, the final sequence in the hospital has Carlos essentially holding off waves of zombies and hunters for several minutes at a time, and it's one of my favourite moments in the game. Shooting is considerably more fun than I was expecting it to be in the Resident Evil 3 remake, and this horde section is a good demonstration of why that is. Weapons feel impactful, and watching a zombie's head explode never gets old, especially in this game. So once you've completed this horde section, the player is put back in control of Jill, who has recovered after Carlos managed to get her the vaccine in time. As Jill, you're able to access some areas of the hospital that Carlos could not reach and find some really useful items, including the Magnum. Once you're done knocking around the hospital, it's time to move on to the game's final location, the research lab. This location is one of my favourites in the game. The action really ramps up at this point, and we are introduced to a terrifying new kind of zombie called a Palehead. Paleheads are almost impossible to kill with handguns, as they will constantly regenerate health if you do not finish them off quickly. There are also some fairly open environments to explore in the lab area, and I appreciated the sense of non-linear progression this location gave me. So once you've created the vaccine required to save the people of Raccoon City, you're thrown straight into another boss fight with Nemesis. As I said earlier, this fight is incredibly similar to the one seen at the clock tower. However, there are some subtle differences, like how Carlos will help you throughout the fight. I appreciated this small touch because it shows just how much Jill and Carlos' relationship has grown since the start of the game. Jill basically wants nothing to do with Carlos when she first meets him, but by the end, she wants him. Shortly after defeating Nemesis for the umpteenth time, he transforms into this monstrosity. I love this design for Nemesis' final form. In the original game, his final form looked a bit silly, but the remake improves on this fight in practically every way. You even get to use this badass rail cannon. The cutscene here where Jill blows Nemesis apart is also pretty satisfying.
Come on! Next time, take a fucking hit!
After defeating Nemesis for the final time, we make our way to the rooftop, where these two sexy boys have a sexy boy fight. We're forced to shoot whichever sexy boy we like the least, and then we escape in a helicopter, while Raccoon City gets blown apart behind us. The end. Okay. So if you've been paying attention to the review so far, and I wouldn't blame you if you haven't, you'd realise that Resident Evil 3 Remake shares very few similarities with the PS1 game. Most areas from the original Resident Evil 3 are either completely missing or have been reworked to such an extent that they're almost unrecognisable from their PS1 counterparts. Nemesis isn't nearly as present in the remake as he should be, and that's a real shame. Puzzles are also practically non-existent for most of the campaign, and that might be a deal breaker for some people. A lot of things have certainly been removed from the Resident Evil 3 remake, but a lot of things have been added too, like the Hunter Gammas for example. In the original game, the Hunter Gammas were very similar to regular hunters, but in the remake they've been reworked into these terrifying monsters. I nearly shat myself the first time I had to take one of these things on in the sewers, and they're probably my favourite enemy type in the whole game. There's also a lot of post-game unlockable content too, in the form of higher difficulties, figurines, concept art, and gameplay modifiers. You can even unlock Jill's classic STARS uniform. The removal of the Mercenaries minigame featured in the PS1 title is almost unforgivable, but at least we got Resident Evil Resistance, which is a pretty fun multiplayer experience. I'm not a fan of online multiplayer games at all, but Resistance was able to hold my attention for longer than I expected. The big sticking point with Resident Evil 3 Remake is unquestionably its length. It's a short game. However, it's not nearly as short as all these reviewers have been telling you. I've seen many journalists claim that their first playthrough of the game took them in the region of 5 hours, which is false. And it's false because they're using the in-game clock to gauge how long it took them to complete the RE3 remake. The in-game clock in Resident Evil 3 only keeps track of the total time you've been in control of Jill. The clock stops whenever there's a cutscene. It stops whenever you're communicating to someone over the walkie-talkie, and it stops during other sequences as well. So if you're worried that your first playthrough of Resident Evil 3 is only going to take you 5 hours, don't be. It will probably take you at least 7. So is Resident Evil 3 Remake worth $60? Well, that depends. If you're only planning on playing through the campaign once and have no interest in Resistance, I'd say no, wait for a sale. However, if you're a huge fan of the series like I am, and enjoy replaying these games over and over again, your money will be well spent on the Resident Evil 3 Remake. It's not even close to being the best game in the series, but it's still an absolute blast to play from start to finish. Phew! Well, I'm glad that's over. Jesus, that virus stuck around a lot longer than anyone was expecting, didn't it, Diary? I'm glad things can finally start returning to normal. I think this whole experience has taught me a lot about life in general though. How often do we take the things we love in life for granted? Some of us need to start realizing how lucky we are. To have a roof over our heads, to be able to afford to feed ourselves daily, to be able to travel the world and see all the amazing things this planet has to offer. Well, I'm done being a selfish piece of shit. I'm going to start being grateful for every day I've got left on this planet. Thank you, Diary, for helping me get through the last 5 years. You're a literal lifesaver. P.S. Any advice on how to dispose of a dead body? That delivery man is starting to smell.